All right, let's dive into one of history's biggest, most complicated questions. What caused World War I? We're going to untangle the complex web of events that led to a conflict that literally redrew the map of the modern world. So, how did one single event set off such an incredible global catastrophe? Let's get into it.
Think about that for a second. One single gunshot, and the result? 17 million people dead. We're not just talking about a war. This was a cataclysm that wiped out a generation. So the question that just hangs over history is, how on earth did it come to this?
Okay, so to really understand the massive explosion that was World War I, you have to start with the spark. And in the summer of 1914, that spark was a single political assassination that kicked off a chain reaction nobody could seem to stop.
And just look at how fast everything went downhill. On June 28th, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the whole Austro-Hungarian Empire, is shot and killed. Less than a month later, Austria-Hungary hits Serbia with an ultimatum that's basically impossible to accept. And then, boom, they declare war. And from there, it's just a free-fall. Within a week, pretty much all the major powers in Europe are at war with each other. The dominoes just fell, one after another with this absolutely breathtaking speed.
So the big question is why? Why did the murder of one man in Sarajevo drag the entire continent and eventually the world into war? Well, the answer lies in this incredibly tangled web of alliances that was basically a preset tripwire system across Europe.
This is basically that chain reaction in action, like a line of dominoes just waiting for a push. When Austria-Hungary went after Serbia, they did it because they knew they had Germany, their big brother, backing them up. But then Russia starts to mobilize its massive army to protect Serbia. Well, that triggers Germany to declare war on Russia, which in turn pulls in Russia's ally, France. It was a perfect storm of commitments, and a local fight in the Balkans went global in just a matter of days.
But here's where it gets a little more complex. We always hear about these entangling alliances, but the reality was, well, messier. The Triple Entente, for example, wasn't some ironclad military pact that forced Britain and France to jump in. And believe it or not, Russia had no formal treaty that said it had to defend Serbia. This is so important because it shows that the leaders in July 1914 were making choices. These weren't automatic, pre-programmed moves. They were decisions driven by fear, national pride, and a whole lot of miscalculation.
So, you get the picture, right? The assassination was just the match. The real story is that Europe itself was a giant powder keg, stuffed with decades of tension, bitter rivalries, and some really dangerous ideas just waiting for a spark to set it all off.
And one of the most powerful and, frankly, terrifying ideas floating around back then was this thing called social Darwinism. It took Darwin's survival of the fittest and applied it to countries. The thinking went that nations were in a constant struggle, and war was a natural, even healthy way to prove who was the strongest. It created a mindset where war wasn't seen as a failure, but as a necessary test of greatness.
And that kind of thinking, it poured gasoline on the fire of militarism. This quote from historian David Stevenson really hits the nail on the head. The massive military buildup all over Europe wasn't just a sign of tension. It actually became a cause of the war itself. When you've got a huge, powerful army, there's this immense pressure to actually use it.
I mean, just look at these numbers. And this is from way back in 1897, almost 20 years before the war started. We're talking millions of men in reserve, ready to be called up. Every country had these incredibly detailed plans to mobilize their armies and their trains to get to the front as fast as possible. It created this dangerous use it or lose it mentality. If you wait, if your enemy moves first, you might lose the war before it even begins.
It wasn't just about who had more soldiers. It was a battle for the seas, too. This naval arms race, especially the rivalry between Britain and Germany, was a huge source of bad blood. Britain had the biggest navy in the world, and they saw it as essential for their empire. So when Germany started building its own fleet of powerful battleships, London saw it as a direct threat. It absolutely poisoned their relationship long before that first shot was ever fired.
And on top of all that, you've got this whole cocktail of other problems brewing. The great powers were all scrambling for colonies and resources around the world. You had this intense, aggressive nationalism sweeping across countries, convincing everyone that their nation was the best and destined for glory. And then there's the sick man of Europe, the collapsing Ottoman Empire, which created this dangerous power vacuum in the Balkans, exactly where Russia and Austria-Hungary were desperate to expand their influence.
Okay, so after all that, the spark, the alliances, the arms race, the clashing empires, who's actually to blame? You know, this is still one of the most fiercely debated questions in all of history.
It really boils down to two main camps. One side puts most of the blame on Germany and Austria-Hungary,
arguing they were the aggressors who either wanted a war or were just incredibly reckless. The other side argues for shared responsibility. They say, look, every single major power, Russia, France, Serbia, Britain, made terrible decisions and miscalculations that helped push Europe over the edge. The real truth is probably somewhere in that complicated middle.
But at the end of the day, no matter who you point the finger at, the result was a human catastrophe on a scale that is still just hard to wrap your head around. 17 million lives lost. An entire generation gone. It was a wound that changed the world forever.
And that leaves us with a pretty heavy question.